Esther is a book that can leave modern readers wondering why it was even in the Bible. It starts with a virgin Jewish woman pleasing a Gentile king so much that he wants to make her his wife, and it ends with the Jews killing thousands of their enemies. In between, God is nowhere mentioned. So where is God if he's even in the story? And how should Christians approach the book today? Well, stay tuned. I'm Brian Seagraves, and this is Understanding Esther. Before we dig into some themes and theological significance in the book of Esther, let's first start by considering who wrote it, when was it written, who was the audience, why was it significant historically? Well, sadly, some of those questions don't have great answers, but they are still worth asking. For instance, we don't know who wrote Esther. The text doesn't state who wrote it. The Jewish Talmud, which was a collection of Jewish writings from later on, says that it was written by the, quote, men of the great synagogue who lived during and after the last of the prophets. Other traditions say that Mordecai himself, who's one of the characters in the book, wrote it. While that could be, it seems unlikely. Most likely, Esther was written by a Jew who lived under Persian rule and was familiar with both Susa, which was the capital, and how the Persian court functioned. But we don't know who that person is. Now, when was it written? The book opens with the phrase, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes," who was also known as Ahasuerus. And he was the king of the Persian Empire at the time. And it seems that the author writes at a distance removed from the events that he goes on to recount. In other words, he's saying, this is what happened during that time back then. The style and vocabulary of the Hebrew in the book is similar to that of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is dated to around the Persian period of about 539 to 323 BC. That's a pretty big window, a few hundreds of years, and we don't know any more specifically than that when it was written. But if it was written later, as in closer and closer to the birth of Christ, we would expect the book to have been influenced much more by Greek than it is. So it's probably dated several hundred years before the birth of Christ, and maybe within 100 to 200 years of the exile. Now, who was the original audience? That's a more important question for Esther than when it was written. Esther was written to record and show the Jewish people God's providential faithfulness to his promises. And in so doing, it explains the origin of the Feast of Purim. And the Jews actually still celebrate this feast today, and they'll gather in the synagogue yearly and read Esther. Now, what is Purim? Well, it's actually the event and the celebration at the end of the book of Esther that was a festival. It marked the saving of the Jewish people from their enemies. Now, why is it called Purim? Well, as we read Esther, we will see that the date on which the Jews were set to be destroyed was actually chosen by the rolling of a die, which is called a pur in their ancient language. And so the feast is called Purim, after the rolling of a die. So when did Esther take place? I think this gets us to more of the theological significance of the book. Esther, if you're reading along in like a chronological Bible reading plan, you might notice you're reading in Ezra, and you read Ezra chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, Esther chapter 1, Esther chapter 2, because the events of Esther fit in the 57-year gap between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, roughly between the years of 483 to 473 BC. Now, what was going on at this time? If we zoom way back into God's covenants and interactions with his people, we see all the way back in Deuteronomy that God says, hey, I'm going to give you the land. You're going to go into it. If you keep my covenant, there are these blessings. And if you break my covenant, there are covenant curses. We see those described in Deuteronomy 28. Exile would be a curse. Famine would be a curse. Destruction would be a curse. And the Jews of Judah and Jerusalem were taken into Babylonian exile in 586 BC by King Nebuchadnezzar. And this exile and destruction of Jerusalem brought their former glory to an end. And it raised questions of how they could still function as God's people. They didn't have access to the temple. They're living in a Gentile land. So how can they still be God's people? And the importance of the exile cannot be overstated. It forever changed Judaism, and it functioned as a turning point in all of biblical history. God finally, after years and years and centuries of patience with his people, judged them for their idolatry and their faithlessness and their rebellion against him. Now, we see in places like Jeremiah 30 that God promised that he would bring a remnant back to Jerusalem one day. And he fulfilled that, actually, through the pagan king Cyrus. He conquered the Jews' conquerors. We see that described in Daniel 5. And then Cyrus returns them to their homeland. That's what's described at the beginning of Ezra, in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And then Ezra and Nehemiah tell of the Jews' return to the land and the rebuilding of the temple. But Esther describes what God's faithfulness looks like to those who didn't, for whatever reason, come back to Jerusalem, those who stayed in Persia. Now, one other important point as we're talking about when this took place and how to make sense of the characters and the timeline, one of the main characters' name is Haman, and he's the son of Hammedatha, and he was an Agagite. And all of these names probably do not sound familiar, but let's refresh ourselves. So Haman, the Agagite, was a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, who had long been bitter enemies of the Jewish people. And centuries earlier, God had commanded King Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. And Saul didn't do it. He used what he thought was his own good judgment, and he did not destroy the king. And so I think the author of Esther is setting up a few things here with Haman, who is the main evil, bad character in the story. One, he functions as this Amalekite, this enemy of God's people who will try to destroy them. But more than that, it shows that if King Saul had been faithful all those many years earlier to destroy them, then maybe Haman wouldn't even be trying to destroy God's people in what Esther recounts. So in the background is a larger struggle that's been going for centuries between the enemies of God's people, the Amalekites, the Gentiles, and the Jews. Now, what about the structure and themes of Esther? What's the big overarching story? Well, it starts with the Jews in Persia. And for whatever reason, like I said, they're still there. They didn't come back. And there's the current queen at the time. Her name is Vashti. She defies Xerxes. And Xerxes, the king, wants her to come out and be seen by his audience. I don't think it's probably something as innocent as, hey, come say hi and wave and go back to your room. It's probably a little more scandalous than that and exploitative of her. And she refuses. And so the kings and the nobles react to this and say, hey, if everyone hears, well, all the women will start disobeying their husbands. So we wouldn't want to seem weak. So let's write a letter to the entire kingdom and tell them all the women need to obey their husbands. Well, that certainly seems like a position of strength. Let's imply that the queen disobeyed, but you all shouldn't. So they don't want people to do what the queen did, but they end up kind of telling everyone what the queen did. And then they set on trying to find a replacement queen. And so part of that is finding many of the young women in the kingdom and bringing them and giving them beauty treatments and other things. And then they get each taken to the king and they spend a night with the king, and whoever pleases the king the most is going to be the king's new wife and queen. And that's actually what happens to Esther. She hasn't made known that she's a Jew, and she spends the night with the king and pleases him such that he is glad to make her his queen. And off they go. And then in the middle of this, right after that, Mordecai foils an assassination attempt against the king. And then it kind of moves on. And Haman, remember, back to the descendant of Agag, he issues a decree of death against the Jews. And then it becomes Esther's defining moment. So Esther is begged to intercede by Mordecai, and she's not so sure she wants to do that. But she ends up being convinced by Mordecai that she needs to help save her people. And so she decides to go before the king, and this would not have been socially acceptable. No one could go without an invitation, but she decides to bear the risk and go before him. And he invites her, and she says, hey, I want to throw a banquet for you. Come to my banquet and bring Haman. So they go to the banquet. And then she says, hey, come to my banquet tomorrow. And in the middle of this, Haman builds a gallows to kill Mordecai. Now, I should pause here and say, when we read gallows, we probably think this tall wooden thing with a rope, and we're going to literally hang someone on it by their neck. It's a hanging. That's not what this is describing. This is describing a very tall, probably a 70-foot tall stake that's pointed at the end that the victim would be impaled on, not hung by their neck, but impaled on. And you'll see this at the end when Haman's sons get killed first, and then Esther requests that they be hung on the gallows. That she wants them, they're already killed, but let's impale them and put them to public shame. One other contextual detail we should consider while we're here is the city gate. If you read Esther, you will see numerous times that such and such happened at the gate. And the gate wasn't just the entrance to the city. It was where official business was conducted and considered and debated and announced. So when Mordecai is often there, it's probably because he had some kind of role in the government. He wasn't just a loiterer, just standing around. He probably had some kind of function, which was why it bothered Haman so much when Haman was also at the gate often for his business, when Mordecai wouldn't stand and recognize him. Because Mordecai had some kind of role, and Haman had a greater role, but was being disrespected in his mind. Okay, back to our walkthrough. So Haman's building this gallows. And then we start to see some reversals happen. And reversal is a huge theme in Esther. The king has a sleepless night, and he asks that some of the history be read. And he discovers that Mordecai actually had saved him from an assassination attempt. And so he thinks, well, what should we do to honor Mordecai? And so he asks Haman, what should be done to honor someone who the king has found favor in? And Haman thinks the king is talking about him. And so he has this long list of very high honors: ride on the king's horse, wear his garments. And so the king says, that sounds great. Do that for Mordecai. And Haman's own family says, this is not going to go well for you. And then they come to the second banquet the next day, and Esther reveals her Jewish identity and says that Haman is the one who's trying to exterminate her and all her people. And the king goes away to think about it. And while he's thinking about it, Haman is pleading for his life, and he falls on Esther. And that's right when the king comes back. And the king is probably thinking, okay, I've given him my kingdom. He has my signet ring. He can do things in my authority. He has ruled everything and has everything in my house and my kingdom except my wife. And now he's trying to take her too. And the king decrees that he should be executed. And one of the people in the palace says, well, there's the huge gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Why don't we put him on that? And so that's what happens. And then Esther introduces Mordecai to the king. And Mordecai actually gets to be in charge of Haman's estate. He gets his signet ring. He gets command of so much in the kingdom. And Mordecai and Esther then get to write a counter edict. They get to send a message out to the kingdom that says, whereas Haman had decreed that every one of the Jews was going to be killed, that order couldn't be countermanded, but they send another edict that says, actually, the Jews get to group together and defend themselves and plunder if they want and kill their enemies. And then the day of the conflict arrives, and the Jews kill many, including Haman's 10 sons. And then Esther asks for their bodies to be displayed. And she actually asks for a second day of killing to ensue, where the Jews get to further pursue their enemies. And then the book ends with the establishment of the Feast of Purim to recognize this, that this event that was supposed to be for their downfall was actually to their victory. Now, there's a lot there. You should certainly read Esther several times. The more you read it, I think the more the story will get into your mind and your heart. And now we get to consider, what does all this mean? What's the theological significance, the practical significance of it? Well, I'm going to tease out some themes for us. One theme is that of reversal. Esther contains many examples of unexpected and often ironic and often humorous reversals. The clearest example is that the plot to destroy the Jews became the means through which they were actually able to destroy their enemies. The powerful king and Haman are also maneuvered and led by the king's wife, even though they're supposed to be the large, powerful men in charge. Haman was given authority and power and planned to destroy the Jews, and he has his power removed, and he himself is destroyed on the very gallows he had built. Mordecai, who is going to be executed, is elevated. So far from being just an interesting literary theme, this is actually one of the main themes in the book. It's not just there and we kind of see it after the fact and say, oh, that's kind of cool. No, it's actually showing God's history of using the weak and the ignoble themes to shame the strong and accomplish his purposes. It was through the attempt of evil that victory came. It was through God judging his enemies that he brought salvation to his people. It was through a shameful, cursed death on a cross that death was destroyed. And it's through losing our lives that we ultimately find them. So the theme of reversal is seen in so many ways throughout the entire book of Esther. I've just given you a sampling of examples. If you read it closely, you will see many others of how God intends things for good that others intend for evil. And that takes us to our second theme. I've already told you a couple times that God is never mentioned in the book, and actually it could lead to questions. Because if the people in the book were different, if they were the Germans, there would be nothing in this story that would make someone think it has religious significance. The people don't do anything religious. Maybe the most religious thing that happens in the book is someone fasts, but it's not even clear that that's a devotedly religious fast. And God is nowhere mentioned. So how do we make sense of it? Well, God is actually the main character. He's the one who weaved all the aforementioned reversals together in a tapestry of salvation for his people. He's fulfilling the kinds of things he said all the way back in Deuteronomy before he gave them the land. I'm going to give you the land, but if you don't follow me, I will judge you and exile you, but I will also bring you back. Well, what would have happened if Haman's plot had succeeded? God would have judged his people, and then they would have been annihilated. He would have not been faithful to bring a remnant back out of exile. So he had promised to discipline them for their sin, yes, but the exile was that. So when Esther is read on the backdrop of the promises of the Old Testament, the exile, the end of the exile, and such, we see that God was the one providentially working through and arranging all of what came to pass. Another theme, banquet and feasting. The Hebrew word for banquet occurs 20 times in the book of Esther and only 24 times in the entire rest of the Old Testament. The theme of banquet or feast is relevant since Esther explains the origin of the Feast of Purim. Now, the story isn't about Purim, but it does explain how the feast came to be. Another example and theme in this book and story is of providence and human responsibility. So in addition to showing God's providential care over his people in all their circumstances, the text demonstrates the consequences of people's chosen bad actions and highlights the need for courageous decisions in the face of evil, even at great personal cost. God is responsible for his part, but we are responsible for ours. Now, you might think this means that there are good character lessons in the book. I do think there are some, but perhaps contrary to some books like Ruth, which highlight great character examples, things are more muddy in Esther. So consider, should one be like Esther? Well, it seems like she was not practicing as a Jew. She wasn't being faithful to the covenant as much as she could be. She didn't even tell anyone she was a Jew. She sexually pleases the king so much as a virgin that he's glad for her to be his queen. So it's a little murky. And at the end of Esther, after the Jews have already killed many of their enemies, she says, hey, can we go kill more of them? That's an interesting dynamic. I'm not saying she did the wrong thing, but I am saying it's a murky picture. And one of the clues we can usually use when we read a book to figure out how to interpret someone's actions and say, what should we emulate? What should we avoid? Is we look at how the narrator describes them. And actually in Esther, the narrator doesn't really seem to evaluate the character of most anyone. It spotlights the ridiculous nature of the king and those who are supposed to have power. But when it comes to Mordecai and Esther, it's less clear. The author just seems to recount that this is what happened. Now, we could go back and look at some of those details about Esther and ask some questions. So, for instance, did Esther have a choice? That's not really clear. I suppose she could have resisted, and the Old Testament would actually say, hey, if you're going to have someone who's going to assault you in the city, cry out, but that assumes there's going to be a sympathetic hearing. So we don't know. We don't know how to evaluate Esther's conduct. And similarly, we don't know how to evaluate Mordecai's conduct. There are positive things they do, and I think there are negative things they do. And it's helpful to remember that in the Bible, no one's Jesus except for Jesus, and no one's Satan except for Satan, as someone has said. In other words, every character is going to be muddy. Now, some are going to be better than others. Some are going to spotlight positive things better than others and negative characteristics more than others. But nonetheless, Esther isn't probably the place I would go for character lessons, though there are some. And you might be saying, well, how do I fit that together? I'm saying be more cautious probably than you would in other books. So we've talked about some themes: banquet, providence, human responsibility, God fulfilling his promises. The last theme would be the self-deception of pride. The more Haman grows in power and prestige, the more prideful he becomes. He seems to want to become the king, even suggesting that his reward should be dressing up like the king and parading around on the king's horse and pretending to be the king. And his pride blinds him to the precarious situation he's created for himself, such that when he falls on the queen, the king may be thinking that the last thing Haman has yet to take for himself is the queen herself. And it's all too easy for Haman to be put on the gallows he made for someone else. And Haman is not unique in this regard. Pride can blind us all. And the reason things are called blind spots is because we are blind to them. By definition, we are blind to our blind spots. We need other people, we need the Spirit, and we need God's word to help us see them. No one is immune from this. So what are some other considerations for Esther as we read it and study it together? Well, is it literature or history? It's both. It is good, compelling history. And the author probably took some liberties in telling the story and how he words certain things, but these are events that happened, that God worked through, and yet it's both. It's literary history, and it tells God's providence and his support of his people. We often think history today should be this kind of blind clinical thing. And the reality is history was supposed to do something historically. And I think the only reason people read history today when they don't have to for school is often because they want to understand what happened and what does it mean and what should I do. History, the telling of it, is supposed to do something. It was recounted for a purpose. The Gospels are similar here. We think of John writing history, but saying that he wrote the life of Jesus so that people would believe and what? Have life in his name. Good prose, an interesting narrative that are also true, help history to be better recalled and achieve the aims for which it was written. Okay, let's wrap this up. I hope Esther encourages you. I hope you see the faithfulness of God to his people and his covenant that he has still to us. Yes, we are at a different place in salvation history, but nonetheless, God is the same. God keeps his word and he keeps it to us. God works through the everyday actions of you and me and everyone. Even when our intents are different than his, he is weaving them together like a tapestry. And the interesting thing about a tapestry is that when you look at the back of it, it's a bunch of threads hanging in a mess. And it looks like some kind of weird shag carpet that you probably would find too ugly to be carpet. And yet when you look at the other side of the tapestry, not the one with all the threads hanging, but the one with the picture, you see that all those threads come together in unexpected ways to create a beautiful picture when viewed from the right perspective, from the true perspective, the one of the creator, of the author of the story and the tapestry. And so it is with us. Our lives are being woven together by the Lord. The scriptures say that Christ upholds all things by the word of his power, that he created all things and they were created for him and they all subsist in him. They're held together by him actively. He turns the hearts of kings. And what Esther shows us is sometimes he even uses unfaithful people to turn the hearts of kings to save his people. And we are his people, and he cares the same.